Chapter 17. Lions and Lambs. My heart was in my mouth as I climbed the hill towards the village. Despite the early hour, the camp was a hive of activity, the fields of grain blanketing the hillside dotted with old women bent over with hoe and sickle. Though I dressed in long robes, wrapped a headscarf over my face, and rubbed dirt into my hands to hide my complexion, I felt naked as a babe as I waded through the wheat, knowing that a single question, a single barked command, would give the game away. Many times I stopped and glanced up to the cliff overlooking the village where Ivan and Terry were watching. I had no choice but to press on. If I turned back, they would just send me out again. But nobody paid me any attention, not even the hundreds of warriors crowding the tent city, cleaning their rifles and grooming their mounts. I strode past them unnoticed, just another Riffian boy among dozens. Through the village gates, the narrow streets bustled with people, mostly women, gathered in large groups outside houses, brewing tea, washing clothes, milling grain on large flat stones, or baking bread in little clay ovens. 100 savory smells floated through the air, setting my stomach rumbling. But though it would have been easy to pilfer a loaf of bread and scarf it down in an alley, I pressed on with my mission, desperate to return to the safety of the hills. In a small square of the main avenue, I came across my first objective, the village well. Ducking to a nearby alley, I pulled a tobacco tin from my robes and held its polished surface up to the sun. Puis. Oh, I signaled. Well, water. A moment later, a small flash of light answered from the cliff, and I tucked the tin away and slipped back into the crowd. At the end of the avenue stood a tall stone wall, its single gate flanked by a pair of guards. This must have been Elkrim's headquarters, I thought. There would be weapons and medicine there, perhaps even stables. Coolly and confidently I strode up to the gate, but was angrily turned back by the guards. This commotion caught the attention of some nearby women, and as they began angrily jabbering from across the street, I bolted and escaped down a nearby alley. Rounding a corner, I emerged into a small courtyard. A group of young children sat around an old bearded man who cradled a large book in his lap. Slowly he ran his finger across the spidery lines of Arabic script, chanting out the words in a raspy, sing-song voice. But the moment I entered, he suddenly glanced up. "Madhadfel," he grunted, his dark eyes glaring under their owlish white brows. "Limada last fi al-fasl?" I bolted again, vaulting over the bewildered students and dashing down another alley. Behind me I heard the angry cries of the teacher as he gave chase. I quickened my pace, only to find myself in yet another courtyard packed with children. They stood in 2 groups around a large square drawn on the ground in chalk, a smaller square drawn at each corner. A stack of 4 flat stones stood at its center. As the children cheered and chanted, a boy hurled a wooden baton at the stones, knocking them to the ground. At once the children on the opposite side sprang forward, scrambling to place the stones on the corner squares while the other children hurled the baton at them again and again. Hearing footsteps behind me, I plunged into the crowd, and a moment later the teacher burst into the courtyard. I fled towards the far wall, only to find myself being pushed, dragged towards the chalk square by the mob of cheering children. A young girl rushed up to me and pressed the baton into my hand, and before I could refuse, the crowd shoved me out in the middle of the clearing, in plain sight of the teacher. Though I could see his tall, dark-robed form looming in the corner of my eye, I dared not look up, fixing my gaze instead on the pile of stones. As the roar of the crowd swelled around me, I raised the baton and hurled it with all my might. It struck home, sending the stones clattering to the ground. As the other team surged forward, I dove into the fray, ducking low to scoop up the baton and hurl it at the nearest player. Again and again I charged into the hurricane of scrambling feet and flying elbows, drunk on the chaos, the din, the thrill of battle. But as I raised the baton to strike out my last foe, a hand seized my wrist and dragged me from the square. Suddenly, I found myself staring into the severe, coal-black eyes of the teacher. Following his gaze, I saw my unraveled headscarf lying in the dust. The game was up. The teacher had barely opened his mouth to scold me when I hurled the baton one last time, striking him dead between the eyes. As he yelped in pain, I wrenched my hand free and bolted for the nearest door. The earthy musk of manure washed over me as I found myself in a stable, sprinting past rows of horses and camels in their stalls. Through the village gates, I entered the warriors' camp and ducked into the nearest tent to hide. I was immediately struck with that rotten garlic smell I'd noticed back in the village mingled with the sour scent of blood and decay, and glancing up I realized I'd stumbled into the hospital. 2 dozen patients lay on stretchers along the tent walls, while a long trestle table laid along the central aisle was piled high with amber-glass bottles and rolls of gauze. And presiding over it all stood a strange figure of a young man, short and slight with pale skin, ruddy cheeks, and long blonde hair gathered in a ponytail. He wore a khaki uniform with cloth puttees around his calves, and a white armband bearing a red cross. With the man's back turned, I seized the opportunity to pilfer some medical supplies. But as I reached for the table, he suddenly turned his head and stared at me with small, watery red eyes, magnified by the round spectacles balanced on his nose. "Who are you?" he said. I froze in place, stunned, for those words were spoken in perfect English. "Hello?" said the man. They sent me to help you," I said. "You speak English?" "Yes." "Oh, thank Christ," the man sighed, grinning broadly. "I have no idea how long it's been since I spoke English to someone." His words were strangely clipped and flat. If he was English, he sounded like no Englishman I'd ever met. "You from England?" he asked. I nodded. "Never met an Englishman out here. Plenty of Frenchmen and Spaniards, sure." "And you?" I finally said. Having spent so long among Frenchmen and Spaniards myself, it took a moment for my own English to return. "Ludlow, Colorado." "That's in America, isn't it?" "Yep. Sergeant Medic Sean Lamb, U.S. Army Expeditionary Force. Well, formerly, anyway." "Edward," I said. "Edward Hawkins." But as I held out my hand, Sean hastily pulled his away. You don't want to touch my hands," he said. "Actually, you'd better cover up." He pointed to a metal bowl on the table, which held a handful of old, yellowed rubber gloves. I started to reach out, but suddenly hesitated. Glancing over my shoulder, I looked out through the tent flap to the cliffs overlooking the village, where Ivan and Terry were waiting. If I stayed here much longer, they would assume I'd been captured and escape without me. I had to send them a signal, some assurance that all was well. Pulling the mirror from my pocket, I stepped towards the tent door. "Hey," said Sean, "where are you going? Come on, I'm going to need your help here." Hastily, I pulled on a pair of gloves and joined Sean at the bedside of a patient, who I immediately recognized as the woman who'd taken my place back in the ruined village. "I need you to cut away her clothes, like this," he said, brandishing a pair of scissors. As I watched, he cut a long slit down the front of her robes and pulled back the flaps, revealing a gruesome swath of bulbous yellow blisters. I gaped, for I had seen this before, all across Father's back. "What is that?" I said. "Mustard gas," Sean sighed. "Nasty stuff, and they call the Riffians savages." "Did they ever use it during the war?" I said. "Oh yeah," said Sean. "I saw a lot of guys in France get gassed. Russia, too. Tough guys, too. They'd get arms and legs blown off and wouldn't even wince. When they got gassed, they'd scream and cry like babies. You couldn't bandage them, couldn't touch them, and those burns take weeks to heal." "France and Russia," I said incredulously. "How did you get all the way out here?" It's a long story." "Mine, too." "Right," said Sean, handing me the scissors. "Careful now, those burns are real sensitive. And don't get your face too close, those vapors will wreck your lungs." Sean held down the woman's hands and feet as she screamed and kicked like a wild animal. Though wide awake, she kept her eyes pressed shut, her head jerking about in confusion. "What's wrong with her?" I said. "She's blind." "Blind?" "Yeah, she got it in the eye," Sean explained. "Good news is, sight usually comes back in a week or two. If she lasts that long." Unable to restrain her any longer, Sean began tenderly stroking the woman's cheek. It's all right, he said softly. "Ashnu esmuk? Es mishan. Ashnu esmuk?" Immediately the woman fell still. Es mi Safia," she croaked. "Safia," said Sean. Netilabas. At this the woman nodded, gritted her teeth, and ceased her struggling. Once her clothes were removed, we soaked bandages in a bowl of milky liquid and laid them over her blisters, then drove tent stakes around the stretcher and laid a cotton sheet over them, forming a small tent that did not touch the woman's skin. It was exhausting work. Red-faced and drenched in sweat, Sean leaned against the tent pole and unbuttoned his tunic. Then I noticed the flaming grenades embroidered on his collar. "Wait," I said. "You were in the Legion?" "Yeah, once upon a time," Sean panted. "Really?" I said excitedly. "So were Ivan and I cut myself off too late. "Who?" said Sean, raising a suspicious eyebrow. Nobody," I said. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Sean eyed me skeptically as he slid down the tent pole and sat cross-legged at its base. "You hungry?" he said, nodding to a small brazier in the corner. I nodded eagerly, having had nothing to eat since that crust of bread the day before. Sean stoked the coals and laid a kettle, a pot, and a few strips of meat on the brazier. "So," he said, "how does an English boy end up all the way out here?" I recounted my whole story from my flight from Bell Rock to that very moment, taking care not to speak too quickly or stumble over my words. The last few days had been a whirlwind, filled with danger, intrigue, and many harrowing escapes. It was difficult to get everything straight. I left out only my escape from the ruined village, lest I betray Ivan and Terry. As far as Sean knew, I had arrived with the caravan the day before. As I spoke, a strange warm feeling rose within my breast. This all-little American was right. There was nothing quite so comforting as speaking one's mother tongue. "Geez, that's one heck of a story," said Sean. "I'm sure yours is just as exciting," I said. "You could say that, yeah," said Sean. Reaching into a rucksack at his side, he produced a long-stemmed smoking pipe and a small bandage tin, which held a thick layer of dark brown, sticky substance. He tore off a small piece, rolled it into a ball between his fingers, and stuffed it into the pipe. "What is that?" I said, as he laid the match to the bowl and took a few tentative puffs. "Keef," he said. "Comes from hemp. Great stuff. Relaxes you, eases your mind. Want some?" No, thank you," I said, wrinkling my nose as a whiff of smoke reached me. Unlike the fragrant apples of Jacques' water pipes, it smelled sour and musty, like rotten cabbage. So," I said, "how'd you get all the way out here?" "Like I said, it's a long story," Sean chuckled, leaning back against the pole. Pensively, he blew a chain of smoke rings as he gathered his thoughts. "Started out as a regular old doughboy," he began. "Like a lot of my school buddies. Young and naive, all of us. Got caught up in all of Wilson's make the world safe for democracy malarkey. Signed up the day war was declared. Folks were pissed, of course. Labor organizers, both of them. Didn't want their son dying for some fat war profiteers. Well, I figured they were just unpatriotic cowards, but they're still my folks, so I promised them I'd sign up as a medic and not kill anybody. Really wish I could see them again. Turns out they were right all along. Now we all signed up looking for adventure and glory, but your dad probably told you there wasn't any of that in France. Just mud and cold rain, fleas, rotten food, and death. Lots of death. Thankfully we weren't in the fight for long, just 6 months, and most of us got through it all right. We were all looking forward to going back home, but then the brass told us we had a new enemy to fight, the Bolsheviks. Bunch of thugs up in Russia, they said, who'd murdered the Tsar and wanted to destroy the peace. Take over Europe just like the Kaiser. So off we went to Archangel, way up in the north. At first it was just like France, except the cold, of course. Never felt cold like that, not even up in the mountains back home. No wonder they called us the polar bears. Anyway, they set me up in the hospital, and every day they'd bring in the wounded. Our guys, Brits, white Russian troops, Bolsheviks, mostly civilians. Then things started going south. The harbor froze up, so we started getting real low on medical supplies, food, ammo, everything. Plus our boys down south were in full retreat, and we couldn't evacuate them. The brass said they had to stand and fight, or else the Red Army would push them into the sea. Morale got real low. Guys started deserting left and right. I held on for a while, but then I started talking with the Russian peasants they were bringing in. They told me how it was under the Tsar. Taxed to death, always starving, beaten by imperial soldiers. No better than medieval serfs. Then I got my hands on some Bolshevik literature, got to see for myself what this Lenin guy was really saying. "Who?" I said. Sean frowned. "Vladimir Lenin," he said. "Leader of the Bolsheviks?" At my blank expression, Sean sighed and took another puff of his pipe. "Anyway," he continued, "started reading all these books, and one day, bam! Just like that, it hit me. We weren't fighting for freedom and democracy. We were fighting and dying for all the kings and emperors and presidents and titans of industry. Keep them rich, keep them in power. And the Bolsheviks weren't some band of thugs like those imperialists wanted us to believe. They wanted to give power to the people, to end their exploitation, to bring about a brotherhood of man where everyone is equal. So I decided then and there to desert. I took a Red Army uniform off a corpse in the morgue, waited for night, then snuck out and headed south towards the front." "Did you find them?" I asked. "The Red Army?" "Oh yeah," said Sean. "They weren't hard to find." "Then why are you here? Why did you leave Russia?" At this, Sean began to laugh, a high-pitched, fluttering giggle like a twittering bird, which soon gave way to a fit of coughing. By the time he recovered, his eyes had grown strangely dull and glassy, wandering erratically in their sockets. "Well, you see, the thing is," he said, still giggling like a drunkard, they didn't exactly trust me. Thought I was a spy, actually. Locked me in the barn for the night, and I heard them talking next door about how they're going to take me out and shoot me in the morning. So I got out there fast, dug my way under the door, and ran out into the woods. Next day I found some railroad tracks and hopped a freight train heading south. Managed to make my way to France, but their gendarmes, well, let's just say they didn't exactly appreciate my new uniform, or the fact I didn't have any papers or money on me. So I ran into the Legion recruiting office and signed up. Figured it was a good way to get a meal, new clothes, ticket out of France. With all their men tied up in the war, they needed troops in Africa to help keep the natives in line, so down they sent me on a boat to Rabat, and by train to the Rif. Now, I'd been planning to desert anyway, but I got beaten to the punch. El Krim's men attacked the train, slaughtered everyone. Well, everyone except me. Seems they needed a medic, and I've been here ever since. I stared wide-eyed at Sean, enraptured by his astonishing tale. I could scarcely believe my good fortune. Tossed into a sea of hostile natives and inscrutable language and custom, I had, against all odds, stumbled upon a familiar piece of flotsam to which I could cling. Here was a fellow wanderer, another bird tossed about on the winds of fortune, a kindred spirit whose harrowing odyssey rivaled my own. So you're just like me, I said. You're not supposed to be here. Neither of us are. You got that right, said Sean drolly, but try telling that to Paris and Madrid. What I mean is, we're both prisoners, I said. Prisoners? Sean scoffed. I'm no prisoner. You see any guards around here? No, I got the run of the place. Come and go as I please. You see, they made me the chief medic of this place. Really, I said. So you can get to the armory, and the stables? Oh yeah, said Sean. Heck, I could walk right through the gates and up to El Krim if I wanted to. My jaw dropped as I realized I no longer needed Ivan and Terry. Sean spoke his captor's language, knew their customs, had won their trust. There was no better man to secure my freedom. Wait, said Sean, his eyes suddenly narrowing. Why do you want the armory and stables? El Krim, you say, I deflected. You know him? Yeah, said Sean, as well as anybody does around here. Why... And you speak Arabic, right? I said, you spoke to that woman, Safia. Not Arabic, said Sean. Riffian. Riffian? Berber language, and only enough to get by. My Spanish and French aren't much better. But you can talk to him, right? Who? El Krim. Talk to him? About what? About letting me go. Go? Go where? Go home. Sean stared at me for a long moment, his wandering eyes struggling to keep focus. No, he said, turning to the brazier. Not gonna happen. What? You came at a bad time, said Sean, handing me a bowl of food. Normally, a kid like you, they'd ransom back to your parents, or colonial authorities, or whoever will pay, and you'd be on your way. But they're preparing this big operation, see, to link up with El Rasuli. El Rasuli, I exclaimed. The bandit? No bandit, said Sean indignantly. He's a freedom fighter, like El Krim. I just don't see eye to eye on methods, is all. Rasuli would rather bankrupt the colonials by kidnapping and ransoming every official's kid he can get his hands on. Anyway, they can't have you running back to Rabat or Meia and spilling the beans on where this camp is, how many men and guns they have. But I wouldn't, I cried. I wouldn't say a word. Truly, I just want to go home. Sorry, kid. You'll just have to hope El Krim wins a quick victory and kicks all the imperialists out. And he will, believe me. Great man. Terrific strategist. All right then, I said, growing desperate. Then we escape. I have 2 maids waiting outside the village. They were in the Legion too. You said you can get into the armory, into the stables? We could slip away at sundown, join up with them, be long gone before they notice we were gone. And why would I want to escape? Said Sean. There was a long silence as Sean swallowed his food. Don't you want to go home? I said. Go home to what? Said Sean. Go home to what? Said Sean. Some factory job, working 12 hours a day, breathing in smog till I drop dead at 40, also some robber baron can line his pockets? No thanks. I gaped at him in confusion. No, I like it out here, said Sean. Got a roof over my head, food, good work, purpose. What more do you need? They're great people, the Berbers. They've been here thousands of years, long before the Arabs came. They're all masters of the desert. Beautiful culture, too. Everyone's equal, works for the common good. If you could just get rid of that primitive superstition, they'd make the perfect society. But it's not the same, I said. It's not home. Surely you want to go back to civilization, not spend the rest of your life living with savages. Sean broke into cruel laughter. Savages, he scoffed. Savages. You see the Riffians invading other nations and enslaving their people for profit? You see them hanging people without trial? You see them dropping mustard gas on innocent women and children? But, I protested, they kill women and children too. They kidnapped us, didn't they? Okay, said Sean, rolling his eyes. Let's say the Kaiser managed to invade your jolly old England. You're telling me you wouldn't fight back? You wouldn't try to kill every one of those Hun bastards that laid his boots on your home soil? That's different. How? I gaped like a landed fish, having no answer. Anyway, said Sean, smirking as he leaned back against the pole, even if you did get home, where are you planning to go? Back to slaving on your father's lighthouse? Actually, I said, I was thinking of joining the Navy. Sean choked, white smoke streaming out his nose like a dragon as he coughed and sputtered. The Navy? He laughed. Really? Yes, I said indignantly. What's wrong with the Navy? Look around you, kid, said Sean, sweeping his hand across the rows of moaning patients. Look what your precious civilization does. You want to be a part of that? But the Spanish did that. Jesus, said Sean, bent over with laughter. They really drilled it into you, didn't they? How do you think your British Empire was built? Well, I was interrupted by the harsh trill of an alarm clock. Sean glanced about in confusion for a moment before reaching to his haversack to silence the alarm. Then he pulled out a tattered red book and opened it across his lap. Eat up, he said, and get back to work. What? The others, said Sean, gesturing to the patients. Like the one I showed you, strip and dress them. But aren't you... They sent you to help me, didn't they? I got other things to take care of. Now get to it. And with that note of finality, Sean dropped his eyes to his book. In an instant, that flicker of hope I'd felt upon meeting this little American guttered out. It was clear he'd gone native, a term I'd heard father use many times, turned his back on his countrymen and become a pawn of el crime. What could have compelled him to such treachery, I wondered, and what had he meant by how your British Empire was built? To be sure, I'd witnessed the barbarism of Captain Barra and the Richelieu's French crew, but surely no Englishman was capable of such atrocities. Whatever the answer, it was clear Sean was of no use to me. I would have to take my chances with Ivan and Thierry. With Sean fully absorbed in his book, I silently slipped away and ducked under the tent canvas. But the moment I stood, I froze as I spotted Redbeard and the teacher marching furiously towards me. Seeing the long bullwhips coiled in their hands, I dove back under the canvas into the tent. You know, said Sean, not lifting his eyes from his book, I'm sure they can find some other work for you to do. That's how it works around here. You don't work, you don't eat. I sighed and set upon the miserable, exhausting task before me. The victims were in a bad way, covered in gas burns and shrapnel wounds, screaming and writhing in agony at the slightest touch. Can't we give them anything, I said? Like morphine? No, said Sean. Ran out of morphine months ago. Only get it when they raid a train or a troop column or something. A bolt of panic flashed down my spine as the tent flap suddenly opened. But to my relief, the figure who entered was not Redbeard or the teacher, but a young Riffian boy, who glanced furtively about before sitting down at Sean's side. He was soon joined by 5 more children who sat in a circle around the American. When all had arrived, Sean opened his book and began to read aloud. When his Riffian failed, he slipped into Spanish, allowing me to catch the occasional word. Fabrica, factory. Obrero, worker. Pueblo, people. As the lesson wore on, I slowly crept down the length of the tent, pausing a moment by each patient until at last I reached the far wall. But just as I was about to slip out, a great commotion suddenly erupted outside. Sean and his students leapt to their feet as a man came bursting into the tent. It was Pierre. He ricocheted about like a loose cannonball, overturning tables and rifling through boxes. Sean and his students could only stare dumbly as the madman turned the hospital inside out. Hey, stop that, said Sean. Get out of here. Don't touch that. But Pierre ignored him, blind and deaf to all around him. After a flurry of aimless searching, he suddenly froze, his eyes falling on a small wooden crate in the corner. He lunged at it, his satchel falling to the ground. As he clawed frantically through the crate, I heard the words he was muttering. Lame de rasoir, lame de rasoir, lame de rasoir. What's he doing? Said Sean, cowering in the corner. What does he want? He says he wants a razor blade. A razor blade? That's what he said. You have one? Yeah, in my kit, but... Your kit there? I said, pointing to his haversack. No, don't touch that. Why? Why not? Are you nuts? What do you figure he's going to do with it? Then I noticed the strange contents of Pierre's satchel strewn across the floor. A wooden slab covered in wires, a copper coil, and a pair of headphones. I knew immediately what they were. What are you doing? Cried Sean as I crossed the tent to retrieve his bag. Rummaging through, I found a shaving kit rolled in a strip of green canvas, from which I plucked a single razor blade. Pierre? I said, turning to the madman. Look here. This is what you wanted, yes? Pierre's head immediately jerked up, his wild eyes fixing on the blade. I threw the blade as he lunged at me, watching it tumble through the air before Pierre caught it. With a laugh of pure triumph, he held it up to the light before hastily gathering up his scavenged odds and ends and dashing out of the tent. Without another thought, I chased off after him.